Welcome to the Charlevoix Stories Project, a continuation of Charlevoix oral traditions. Today's October 5th, 2016, and we're in the Charlevoix Public Library in Charlevoix, Michigan. I'm Denise Fate, president of the Charlevoix Historical Society, and with us today is Dr. Jack MacKenzie, who's going to talk to us about Charlevoix streets and how they got their names. Jack, tell us what initially brought you to Charlevoix and how long you've been coming here.
Well, after my career as a family doctor, it came time to retire, and why not Charlevoix? It's a paradise, and so we'd been coming up here and enjoying vacation. So we built a home, and we have lived here now since 1998, full-time.
And what got you interested in the subject of streets in Charlevoix?
Well, you know, when you retirees come, everybody is after them for volunteer places, Kiwanis and Lions and everything. I just happened to be lucky enough to get introduced to the Historical Society. And Denise, as you know, that's a working board. And I felt I had to do more than just go to meetings. So looked for a project, and it occurred to me that all of these street signs with names had to be named for somebody, so I took that on as a project, the Charlevoix streets and how they got their names. And it was, turned out to be a project of love. It took me over 2 years to get into it, because if you look in our local phone book, you'll see there are about 139 streets in this area. And now, of course, some of those are outside the city limits, but of great interest. And there's another 40 or 50 that are descriptive things like Eagle and Oak and Cherry and Meadow Lane. And so I eliminated those and just stuck with those that were named for somebody. And that ended up to be almost 76 streets.
And what were your main sources of information on these street names?
Well, nobody could do a project like this without a lot of help. And there were local folks like the wonderful Marilyn and Dale Boss, who were part of the history themselves. Edith Gilbert, with her wonderful book on summer resorts, and she was a tremendous source. John Martin, who was the commissioner of streets and the grandson of one of the street names, Martin. Who could do without Google, of course. Then there was the wonderful book down in Kay Heisey gave me on the history of the Grand Traverse region. The resources with Dave and Steve Miles, or Steve Gosley and Dave Miles, and the archives of the old newspapers. And Rosa Nettleton, she's just something wonderful. But here's a woman who collected almost 60 years of the Sentinel newspapers back up until 1910, and then went through them and pulled out information of the articles of history, the social life, the political life, and then put them into decades. So those are in this wonderful library, in the archives here. Online, people can go in and read these selected articles that give you the tremendous history of Charlevoix. I went through them all and then selectively picked out the ones that had names that had to do with the streets or sidewalks or social events that mentioned the names that I had seen on the street signs. So Rosa Nettleton's archives were invaluable. The last one would have been going to the city hall. And in the town hall, they have the actual minutes in the old books of all of the council meetings from the village right through when they became a city. So scanned all of those for anything that had to do with streets or the names of these people. So there was a wealth of material. It just took a lot of time.
And how did you get it organized? Did you have maps to work from, or?
Yes. Oh, I didn't mention the fact that the tremendous wealth of pictures that we have in our own Historical Society Museum at Harsha House. That's where all the pictures on these slides came from, with pictures of as many of the actual persons they could, the maps, the streets, and so forth. So that was a big help.
Okay.
Here is the plat map. Now, if there's any way to, this was done by John Dickson in 1866. Now, if there are any two persons who need to be mentioned in streets in this short interview that we're doing, it would be John Dickson and Seth Mason. These two had a tremendous impact on the history of Charlevoix. They're completely different. John Dickson and his wife Phoebe were both highly educated, graduated from Oberlin College in the East, and arrived here in 1855 with no place to sleep, spent their first night in an abandoned fishing shanty on Round Lake where Edgewater is now. Seth Mason arrived a couple of years later in October of 1857. This map is a pigeon view overview of Charlevoix. What it shows is that Seth Mason actually owned a farm, eventually the farm, which is almost the entire south part of Charlevoix. He owned the whole farm, except for where the Belvedere Club is. All this over to Carpenter Road was Seth Mason's farm. John Dickson, on the other hand, across the bridge, owned the farm on the other side. He owned almost all of North Charlevoix, and between the two of them, they apparently owned the land where the village was. And that's what this plat showed, was that in 1866, and the writing down here was very hard to discern, but it comes out that John Dickson and his wife Phoebe and Seth Mason and his wife Phoebe, auditors of the village, donated this land in between what the Wags called the Mason-Dixon line, but in between here for the village. And they hired John Dickson to lay out these streets. So he was the one that, in part between the two of them, they probably named the streets, I suppose. One being Mason, of course, and then what's now Park Street originally was called Main Street because they thought at that time that Main along the channel was going to be the business street. Turned out to be residential, and the name was changed at the turn of the century to Park. But they laid this out into some 16 blocks, and then each block had the lots. So those two had a tremendous impact on the beginnings of things. So,
what are some themes in the names of famous people or military, or are there some common themes in the different types of naming, street naming, military generals, or?
Well, of course, they named we have Grant, Sheridan, and Sherman. And incidentally, I told you this was done in 1866, so this Grant Street was named for Grant, not when he was because he was president, but because he was probably the second most popular person in the Union at that time after the war. And all three of these generals were four-star generals, so they were given that's why they were named for. Given the names for it. Yeah. Of course, Lincoln, obviously.
What about some other early settlers or notable citizens of Charlevoix that come to mind?
Then you go on to all these other names, like Ainsley, I did them alphabetically instantly. I went right through from Ainsley first to Wood was the last one. And every one of these persons had a story and an impact on the history of Charlevoix. Ainsley, just quickly, and many of them were veterans of the Civil War, and several of them had been wounded. Ainsley came here and became the first one of the jobs he took was the mail. He had to bring the mail from Traverse City to Sheboygan. There were no roads there at that time. He had to do it by horseback, a couple of weeks, old Indian trails on horseback to bring the mail to the folks. So it was a rather slow process for him. But he later on became important and officials in the village. But it's not just the persons like Ainsley. He had a family and he had daughters. And at that time, we're not talking about internet and cell phones and television or movies or even radio or even electricity. So Ainsley's daughters would have beautiful voices. So when there were meetings like the Historical Society meeting, they would be invited to be the entertainment. And so it wasn't just Ainsley himself, it was members of the family that were being honored, I think, in some of these. So that's just one person, and I'm telling you there's 75 more, so I don't know almost how to or where to start with all of it.
Did you find any interesting connections to your own family or background?
Yes, I did. And one of the things, since Denise became president, we have a new motto that tells us, tell us exactly the words.
Bridging our past with our future.
Bridging our past with the future. I tried to do that as back then, to connect the past and the present and the future. I told you Seth Mason arrived here on October 26, almost 160 years ago now, arrived here in October. That exact same time was my grandfather was born on board a sailing ship as in the mid-Atlantic as the family was immigrating from Scotland to Canada. So what possible difference could that make? Well, he went on to become a family doctor in Ontario in the town of Strathroy, which is between Sarnia and London. Strathroy was the home of a family called Auld of our street, A-U-L-D. And George Washington Crowder, one of our Crowder Street, was a Canadian. He was here. He went to Strathroy and brought Mary back and married her. The connection is that Mary was there at the time that my grandfather was the family doctor. In a town that small, everybody would have at least known the doctors. So I know that connection with Mary Auld and my grandfather, he may have even been her doctor. And so that's inconsequential, but it is a connection to the...
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Oh, what's another unusual name or pick a part of the alphabet that you might want to cover?
I think maybe a good one would be Ed Waller. Ed Waller was a very wealthy man from Chicago, developer. He was a friend, or at least knew Frank Lloyd Wright. He also was a member of the Chicago Club. There's a big, huge chunk of land between Mount McSaba and Big Rock. For the first person to buy that was a man named Felt, F-E-L-T, from Indiana. He bought thousands of acres. He owned it. He's the same man who built, in 1901 or 2, a huge sugar beet factory right where the Irish Boat Works is on Stover Creek. That factory It was a big-time employer, but it failed financially. In about 10 years, closed it down, and it sat there until the Irish Boat Works demolished and put in there. But Felt had then sold that chunk of land to Ed Waller. So Ed Waller owned all of that land. He got Frank Lloyd Wright to build a huge, beautiful, luxurious natatorium, indoor swimming pool up on the banks, the sand dunes overlooking Lake Michigan. Big fireplace in it. It was gorgeous and luxurious, but it burned down in 1920 or so, and I'm not even sure exactly where it was, but it's gone. But Ed also, the Chicago Club felt the need, because Belvedere had a golf course. The Chicago Club wanted a golf course, and Ed Waller donated the land where our current municipal golf course. It was 18 holes. He donated that land to and they built the golf course. And all of this kind of ties because some of the greatest golfing names came there because of the wealthy guests. But we had probably Ben Hogan, Gene Sargent, Sammy Snead, Tommy Armour, and Walter Hagen.
Right.
All of those men played the course that right now anybody can go and play on that course. Eventually, Chicago Club sold the course to the city for $1. The $1 sold off the back nine for an industrial park, but all of that had to do with Ed Waller, and that street is out there at the present time.
Yeah. Now, cutting through the golf course is Mercer. Where did the Mercer name come from?
Well, Mercer is a name that was very difficult to track down, and I prefaced some of my remarks by saying that I don't know that everything I say will stand up to fact check. But if it isn't the way it was, it may be the way it should have been. But
right.
John Dickson's farm eventually was sold to the railroad, and the whole place was called Lindsay Park. They hired John Dickson as an engineer, and he laid out all the streets in North Charlevoix where that is. Before the golf course was even there. The C&O was the railroad, Chesapeake and Ohio. That was not just a railroad. It was a company that had plans to make a canal from the Chesapeake Bay to the Ohio River, right through the Appalachians, like the Erie Canal had. It never got any further than the Appalachians, but the big gun, the honcho, and back of that was a man named Mercer. So I'm assuming, since that railroad connection, that Mercer
makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, tell me, many people think Bridge Street would logically be named because we have a bridge in town. Is that true?
Yes, I think so. We also had a mayor named Bridgewood. He came along after the Bridge Street. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, there was a Henry Bridge or somebody Bridge. Okay.
Well, you know, we're on our 7th bridge now. The first one being just a plank that went across. That's another thing that Seth Mason had a family, and one of his daughters in her diary talked about watching her brother John at age 10 walking across the Pine River. It's only 2 feet deep until it was dredged.
Yeah. Okay. Gosh, what are some other notables? Go through the alphabet. Who was Mr. Wood? You wrap up with Wood.
Well, that was one. There were several Woods, and I'm sorry that one's not easy to come by. But you know, I was telling Denise that I got off on tangents occasionally. I have to tell you one. Kit Carson Street, was named by a man who ran the Carson Lumber Company, which was where the Flapjack Restaurant is now. That was his company. He had a lovely home on West Dickson, just where the little park is. There's a vignette in Edith Gilbert's summer resort book about Kit Carson saying one Sunday morning he was out working in the yard in his grubby clothes when a very fancy car, chauffeur-driven car from one of the wealthy ladies in one of the clubs drove by, and she saw him and thinking maybe she could hire him to work in her yard, rolled the window down and he came and says, "My good man," she said, "what does the lady of the house pay you to do this work you're doing?" And he said, "Well, ma'am, she doesn't really pay me anything, but every once in a while she lets me sleep with her." So the window went up and away went the car, and that was the end of that.
Oh, that's a great story.
Yeah.
Yeah. We have an Alice Street. Who do you think Alice is named after?
Well, that was one that led me astray too, because I couldn't find Alice or May. And then I found in the archives that there was a tugboat called Alice Campbell, one that was used to dredge. I said, well, they couldn't have named a street after a tugboat, but Alice Campbell. But then I found this story in the paper about Mrs. P.D. Campbell, who was very socially prominent. She was the wife of P.D. Campbell, who was the captain of the Beaver Island Ferry. And the story was that she'd gone out to Seattle to see her son-in-law, a lawyer. He'd taken her a trip up the Inland Waterway. Then she'd gone down to San Jose, just south of San Francisco. Now, the date was in May of 1906, which became significant that's when the earthquake struck San Francisco. So here was a lady a prominent lady, citizen, who was actually part of one of the great natural disasters in this country. And she described it in her diary as a sea captain's wife would have, how it felt like being on a ship that was rolling in waves and reversing. So her description was very nautical. Well, so I figured that was, and so I gave the talk and credited it with Mrs. Alice P.D. Campbell. Well, her granddaughter, Ann Banfield, who has been on our board, came up to me after the talk, said, "Jack," says, "I loved hearing the story about my grandmother, but her name wasn't Alice, her name was Lois." Yeah. And so I had the wrong, but the story was so good that I left it in the, and then found out that Alice and May, those two streets, were named after the daughters of a man named Newman, Henry Newman, who helped to develop that area.
Okay, and we also have a Newman Street, I think.
Yeah, that's right. There's a Newman Street, and it was his daughters. Now, there was another connection there with my family because Henry Newman was a cooper, among other things. Henry Newman built barrels. My great-great-grandfather, Finlay MacKenzie, in Strathfether, Scotland, in the Highlands, was a cooper. Now, the MacKenzies who immigrated here did pretty well. They had 4 or 5 doctors, a whole snoot full of nurses, bankers, and all kinds of good things, poets. But the one they all brag about is Finlay, because the barrels Finlay made were the barrels that they aged the Scotch whiskey in. And for MacKenzie, you can't get better bragging rights than that. So there was Cooper and MacKenzie that.
Good, interesting. Do you have any other images that you wanted to show?
Well, I do have a picture of John and Phoebe Dickson.
Yeah.
And they were very, and incidentally, after starting out in that abandoned fisherman's cabin, they ended up with an absolutely lovely home, which exists today right there at the corner as you off of Mercer and Cherry, as you turn down into the C&O Club, is their home. Dr. Gels lives there at the present time. And so, and then the other image is Seth Mason. And look at the difference. You see, Seth was sort of a down-to-earth guy. There he is with his snowshoes, probably out on Round Lake with ice shanties there. And incidentally, when he arrived with Morris Stockman, who was his partner, the two of them married two sisters, they had to spend their first night in an abandoned fisherman's cabin on Round Lake. Now, whether it was the same cabin or not, I don't know.
And I think we have a Stockman Road, street somewhere, right?
Yeah, Stockman. Yeah, that was Seth and Stockman built a very large mercantile business on Bridge Street. And Carpenter also.
Yes.
A huge building. Carpenter, Bridge Street originally was really just a dirt road. It didn't even go up the hill. They did not think that that was going to be a major road, and it was all wooded. So when the schooners came into Round Lake, they had to unload and carry stuff up through pathways to State Street, which had become the business street. Carpenter had the vision. He said, doesn't make sense. So he went down and built this big mercantile business on Bridge Street because it was closer to where they could unload the goods. And it wasn't long from then that everybody followed. Incidentally, here is a picture of our beloved State Street before it was paved. And this is this corner right here is Antrim, is looking up toward the bridge, and you can see the marks from the wagon wheels. And so Bridge Street wasn't paved until around 1900. Of course, that's a whole other story. It might be of interest because when it came time to pave the streets of Charlevoix, because they were, the articles in the newspaper, they were a disgrace. There were so much dust everywhere when it was dry, and there were mud holes when it was wet. The mayor and some of the councils went down on a kind of a boondoggle to Ann Arbor, which was the first town that had paved streets, and found out that there was a company called the Bitulithic Company of Detroit, and they were happy with it, so they hired them to pave the streets. But Charlevoix is never without controversy.
Right.
There were people who were afraid on the hills, both coming down both hills and the hill down toward the depot, that the horses would slip. So the compromise was to put in the concrete, bitulithic concrete, and groove them.
Right.
So they all looked like bricks, thinking the horse hoofs would have a bit by bit, all that was either removed or paved over until the last bit was the road down to the depot. And what was it, 4 or 5 years ago, finally that street was paved over, and the Historical Society got a chunk of that, maybe 4 or 5 feet by 8 feet. So if you go into the driveway at the depot parking lot, there is an example of the grooved cement that looks like bricks.
Which served a good purpose. Yeah. Very interesting. Yeah.
I don't mean to ramble here, Denise, but
No,
the next
that's
thing,
good.
because that leads me to think of something else that the Historical Society saved. There was a man named Meach, and there's a Meach Street. Meach was a big-time lumberman, as was John Nichols. John Nichols actually pulled together a consortium of lumber people and put the lumber mill where the Edgewater is now. It was a huge Charlevoix lumber company. Meach and the other lumber persons brought in millions, not thousands, but millions of board feet of lumber in this area. Actually, Michigan produced something like 4.5 billion board feet. Now, a board feet is 1 foot wide, 1 foot long, 1 inch thick. And someone figured out that from Michigan alone would have built a sidewalk that stretched all the way from the earth to the moon and back. Now, Meach built a home. He also had a mill in Norwood, incidentally, but he had a 7-bedroom home on which is now Meach Street. He sold it to a man named Cook, K-O-C-H, but pronounced Cook. Cook built on that spot the notorious Colonial Club, which is part of Charlevoix's history. It was a club that all during Prohibition, you could go there and drink and gamble and nobody bothered him. It wasn't friendly to locals, but wealthy people from all over the state and Chicago and St. Louis and Detroit came there, as well as the head of the Chicago gangs that were there. And Cook was so politically important that the governor of the state had #1 license plate. Cook had #2 on his license plate. He got away with it until about the mid-1940s when the feds finally closed him down. But did I have the picture of that? Yes, here. This is a picture of the Colonial Club. And what I'm leading up to is that it was surrounded by a gorgeous wrought iron fence with a gateway to go through to get in. The Historical Society somehow preserved or got hold of most of that fence, had it restored. So today, when you walk into the depot through those gates, those are the gates and fencing from the Colonial Club, and you're walking through gates that the high Muckaluck influential people, and maybe even Al Capone might have walked through those same. So there's again what our wonderful Historical Society has
been able to preserve.
This reminds me this one. David Nettleton married John Nichols' daughter. And a wonderful, all of these are articles in the newspaper. Unfortunately, she died. And along came this very lovely Rosa Saunders, a woman who had been born in London, England, and 30 years his junior. And he lucked out to marry her. Now, Rosa is the one I told you that collected all of these articles from the newspaper. She also was a painter and in both oils and watercolors and a poet. And so many of her paintings are hanging in our museum at Harsh House. But David Nettleton was a carpenter and a man of great experience and a wagon builder. He had a franchise from the Studebaker Company. Before they made cars, they made wagons, and he had sort of the franchise. But he also built this for the first Charlevoix City Band, which incidentally is now, I think this is its 130th year this year. And this was, he built for the Charlevoix Cigar Company, but the band was about 10 years old at this time. So here is the Charlevoix City Band in this wagon that David Nettleton built. Now, to bring that up to the present, if you had been to any one of the last 3 Venetian parades, Gary Stutzman and the band had this wagon facade reproduced and put it against the flatbed, not pulled by horses anymore, but the last 3 parades, this thing came down with the band 130 years later.
Amazing.
So there's another bridging.
Yes, fantastic.
And
and Nettleton's a prominent road in town.
Yeah.
I want to ask you about Phoebe. we have a Phoebe Street, but which is that, Mason or Dickson, or how do you think they settled that?
I'm sorry, if there is a Phoebe Street, I
No.
don't,
Oh, okay.
I don't think so.
No. Okay.
But that seemed to be a very popular name.
Yes. Okay. What about Ferry?
Well, Ferry, everybody kind of thinks it's because of the Orange and Ferry, which is a story in its own. But no, it was from the Ferry Seed Company.
Yeah.
And they built along where the Foster Boat Works is now, a huge factory. Had problems with it because the first one they built, I believe, sort of collapsed. Then they rebuilt it, and it burned down and rebuilt it a second time. But it was a big-time employer here until they closed it down. I've forgotten the exact years, but but the train came right by. But they talked about shipping not bushels but carloads of seeds from that plant to sell. So it was from the Ferry, and that building was later taken over by Foster Boat Works, and they built beautiful boats, and including when the World War II came, landing craft boats, I believe, for the service. And then after the war, it was converted into the condominium type place it is now.
Goodness, I think we've covered quite a few of the 46. Anything else come to mind?
Well, maybe you've, let's see.
A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H.
I'm sorry, but I kind of got
Park is.
Well, I said originally was Main Street, but because they thought that was going to be it, but it became residential. And a man named Gilbert, Edith Gilbert's family, lived there and was very influential. And the newspaper article said that the citizens of who live on Main Street would like to have it changed because it's a misnomer, and it said, and they will have it changed. And 1 week later, the newspaper article said, yes, it was
to Park, yeah.
Things moved a little faster then. There were articles in the paper saying, why doesn't our pathmaster, they called him, remove those stumps from Clinton Street? 1 week later, articles, I see that the stumps have been removed. So things happen.
Now, who was Clinton? We've had a president since then, but it was named many years before that.
Clinton was DeWitt Clinton.
Okay.
And deserved a street because nobody, he was a package and a half. He was governor of the state of New York. He was mayor of New York City. He was a senator. He ran for president of the United States, but was beaten by Madison. But he was the one who was responsible for, over the years, of bringing the Erie Canal. DeWitt Clinton brought it personally, almost responsible for that canal, which opened up the entire, Buffalo and Detroit and Chicago to all this huge immigration. This is before railroad, actually. So, and DeWitt Clinton deserves a street because of the influence. But when he finished the canal, he came to Lake Erie and he got a bucket of water and he took it back and emptied it into the Hudson River and said this was the weddings of the waters. So,
oh my gosh. Interesting.
So there you have Clinton.
Lots of connections.
Yeah.
Okay. Very interesting. I see a slide here did you want to?
Well, that one has, that has to do, and I told you, this was before they had, these people were intelligent and many educated people. They starved for culture. You can't believe the number of clubs that they formed. A literary club, a dance club, a historical society, on and on and on and on. This happened to have been from an article in the newspaper in 1876, which was an election year. I believe it was Tilden versus Rutherford Hayes. And the ladies in town apparently becoming upset with some of the blasphemous talk that they were hearing politically from their spouses. So they formed this club, an anti-swearing club. And in the newspaper, the article was basically, there's a new anti-swearing, but we're going to wait till after the election, then we'll join.
Yeah.
So
Oh my
it's
gosh.
apropos for right now. 'Cause
Yes.
I think a lot of people are using some appellations that aren't too good about it.
Leading up to a presidential election.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Gosh.
Well, there, as I said, every one of these streets had a name. There was a lot more on Crowder and Hampton. Hampton was the editor of one of our newspapers that became the Courier. He was a bicycle fan and formed a bicycle club and took a great big up around Division Road by McSaba. He put a bicycle racing track there.
Wow.
And there's pictures of him in our program. And one of the man who won the world's bicycle championship is in the picture next to Will Hampton.
Wow.
And
Wow.
so
Interesting.
That's another one.
Well, it's a great way to learn about the history of Charlevoix,
Well,
isn't
yes, that was the whole point of it. And as I say, every one of them has a story. And so
Yeah, great. Thank you very much for speaking with us today, Jack.
it was a real pleasure, Denise. Thank you.